My name is Margaret Wells, and if anyone had seen my life from the outside, they would have called me lucky. A good education, a stable job, a tidy house in a quiet neighborhood of St. Paul, Minnesota, and a husband who always smiles in photographs. But the truth was, behind this outward stability hid a habit of surviving, not living. My parents died when I was 8. A fire in the old house, a short circuit, a night that ended my childhood. I was taken in by Aunt Nora, my mother's cousin. She was a strict, frugal, and extremely practical woman. She expressed love through order and control. I learned not to cry, not to complain, and not to ask unnecessary questions. If I wanted something, I had to prove I deserved it. By 34, I became an architect in a design firm, specializing in the renovation of old buildings and working mostly from home. I bought a 2-story townhouse 5 years before getting married. It was my fortress. A bright office on the second floor, large windows, silence. I knew every creak in the floor, every crack in the wall. It was the first place in my life where I felt safe. I met Eric at a charity event. He was charismatic, a good listener, and often spoke about the value of family. He seemed the opposite of me, open, emotional, surrounded by family and friends. I felt like I could finally relax with him. We got married a year later. Eric moved in with me, and I had no doubt about it. He often said my house was the perfect place to live, that it was truly cozy. Sometimes he added that the house was big and could easily accommodate guests. I nodded, although I felt a slight tension inside. But I didn't know how to say no. I always thought love was a compromise. The first warning sign was quiet. Eric mentioned one day at dinner that his older sister, Laura, might be coming over for a few days. I asked when exactly, and he shrugged.
Soon.
Don't worry, you won't even notice. I noticed. The first few days after Laura's arrival, I tried to convince myself it wasn't that bad. I said it silently, repeating it like a mantra when I went down to the kitchen in the mornings and saw piles of unwashed dishes left overnight. When I heard Ben slamming doors and Chloe loudly discussing classmates on the phone, sitting right on my desk, I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed to wait it out, that Eric's family was used to living differently, and that I was too withdrawn. But every day took a little more air out of me. My work schedule began to unravel almost immediately. I'd gotten used to a clear rhythm, morning coffee, checking email, drawings, video calls. Now, instead, I began each morning with a sense of intrusion. Someone was already in the kitchen. Someone was laughing loudly. Someone was asking questions without asking if it was a good time for me to answer. "Are you even working today?" Laura asked casually, watching me open my laptop at the kitchen table. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I have a project with a deadline." "It's funny," she chuckled. "I always thought work was leaving the house." The phrase stuck in my head. It repeated itself over and over, every time I tried to concentrate and couldn't. When someone turned on the TV. When Chloe hogged the internet, downloading TV shows. When Ben walked into the room without knocking and took my things because they were just lying around. I tried to get my office back several times. I said I needed space, that I couldn't work in the noise. Laura listened with a polite smile, but nothing changed. Eric either remained silent during these conversations or said I was exaggerating. "You're overreacting," he said one evening when I was crying from exhaustion. "She's my sister. She didn't mean to be mean." Not mean to be mean. That was his favorite excuse. No one did anything mean. I was just getting worse. After a week, I began to notice that Laura was acting as if the house was truly hers. She made decisions without discussion, invited people over, planned dinners, gave me assignments, not directly but as if they were a given. "You're home anyway," she'd say. "It's not that hard." I caught myself apologizing for my own needs, behind closed doors, for asking me to keep my voice down, for wanting to be alone. That was the scariest part, not that they'd invaded my home, but that I'd begun to doubt my right to it. One evening, I returned from a short walk, just to get some air, to find the furniture in the living room rearranged. My favorite floor lamp was gone. It had been replaced with a bright lamp Laura had brought. "It's more comfortable this way," she said. "And the kids like it better." I felt a wave rise inside me. Not anger, no. Something cold, heavy, a realization. I was no longer participating in my own life. Eric was working late more and more often. When I asked, he'd say he was tired, that he needed space. Space. The words sounded almost mocking. I was surrounded by people, and yet I felt completely alone. The climax came one evening when I overheard Laura on the phone. She was sitting in the kitchen, oblivious to me on the stairs. "Yes, they have a big house," she said. "It's convenient. Margaret is strange, of course, working all the time, but she'll get used to it. The main thing is that Eric is on my side." These words hit harder than any shouting. I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, not a temporary setback. It was a system that didn't allow for me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to footsteps, hearing voices, and for the first time I asked myself a question I'd been afraid to even formulate. What if the problem isn't them, but that I allowed this to happen? In the morning, I got up before everyone else. I gathered my documents and laptop, left the house, and went to the nearest library. It was quiet there. No one asked why I was working. I sat at my desk for 6 hours and, for the first time in a long time, felt like I could breathe again. When I returned home, Laura was displeased. "Where have you been?" she asked. "We were expecting you to cook dinner." I looked at her and didn't answer. Because for the first time in a long time I realized I no longer had an obligation. And it was from that moment that everything began to change. After that evening, when I didn't answer Laura, tension hung in the house. It wasn't loud or obvious, more like a sticky, viscous fog you have to wade through, unsure of your path. Laura stopped smiling at me with her condescending smile, but she didn't openly confront me either. She simply started ignoring me. That was even worse. It was as if I'd ceased to exist as a person, transformed into a function that had to perform tasks but had no right to an opinion. Eric noticed the changes, but interpreted them differently. He said I'd become cold, distant, that I was creating my own tension. I tried to explain that I felt out of place in my own home, that I was struggling, that I needed space and support. He listened, nodded, and then said something that completely knocked the wind out from under me. "You take everything too personally." Every time he said that, I wanted to disappear. Not leave, vanish, become invisible, so I wouldn't feel this pain anymore. Work became my only salvation. I took on extra projects, staying late at my laptop, because that's when the house quieted down. But even at night, people would find me. Laura would come in without knocking and ask if I'd seen her charger. Chloe would turn on the light, oblivious to the fact that I was working. One day, I discovered that some of my work documents had disappeared. I searched everywhere for them until I accidentally saw Ben drawing on printed plans. "It's just paper," he said when I tried to explain its importance. "Mom said you have a lot of these." I felt something inside me break. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just went into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time, staring into space. I felt like if I let myself get emotional, I wouldn't be able to stop. The turning point came the day Eric announced that Laura and the kids would be staying indefinitely. He said it casually over dinner, as if he were talking about the weather. "They're having housing difficulties," he said. "You need to understand." "What about my situation?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Then he shrugged. "You're strong. You can handle it." These words were spoken without malice. That's why they cut so deeply. I suddenly realized that my strength in his eyes wasn't a virtue, but a resource that could be used without limit. That night, I gathered all the documents for my home, work, and bills. For the first time, I considered what would happen if I left. The thought was both terrifying and strangely relieving. A few days later, an incident occurred that completely shattered the illusion of normalcy. I was preparing for an important online presentation for investors. It was a project I'd been working on for almost a year. I'd asked for silence beforehand, locked myself in the bedroom, and plugged in my headphones. The presentation had lasted 10 minutes when the door swung open. Laura walked in, ignoring the screen filled with faces. "We need your room urgently," she said. "Ben has guests." I felt the world tilt. I tried to gesture that I couldn't speak, but she didn't stop. "What kind of upbringing is this?" she added, looking directly into the camera. No respect for elders at all. The connection was cut off. I stared at the black screen and realized I'd just lost more than just a meeting. I'd lost my reputation. When Eric returned home, I told him everything. I spoke calmly, clearly, without hysteria. I told him I couldn't take it anymore, that I needed his family to move out, or I'd leave. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You're forcing me to choose."
No, irraplia.
I choose myself. It was the first clear sentence I'd spoken in a long time. It sounded unfamiliar, but right. Eric left the room, slamming the door. I remained sitting on the bed, shaking with adrenaline. I didn't know how it would end, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had my voice back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat and looked out the window at the city lights, and I realized there was no turning back. Even if I stayed in this marriage, my old life would never be the same. And it was this realization that gave me a strange, frightening sense of freedom. After that conversation, Eric hardly showed up at home. He left early, returned late, avoided eye contact, and spoke in short, clipped sentences. Laura acted as if nothing had happened, but a new note had crept into her voice, a condescending superiority. It was as if she were certain everything had already been decided in her favor. I lived as if on autopilot. I got up, worked, ate, and worked again. The house became a transit space where I tried to spend as little time as possible. Sometimes I caught myself sitting in the car in the parking lot, unable to bring myself to leave. There were too many people inside, and too little of me. A few days later, Eric finally spoke. It happened over dinner, which I didn't cook. Laura set the table, loudly commenting that sometimes it's good to take charge. The children were noisy. The TV was playing in the background. Eric sat down across from me and said, without raising his voice, "I've been thinking. Laura, and the kids are staying. It's hard for them right now. You just need to get used to it." I felt a strange calm.
No anger, no tears.
Just clarity. "Then I'm leaving," I replied. He blinked, as if he didn't immediately understand the meaning of the words. "What do you mean, leaving?" "Then I don't live here anymore." Laura fell silent. The room grew unusually quiet. "You can't just up and leave," Eric said. "This is our home." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no doubt. This is my home. I bought it long before we got married. And that's exactly why I'm leaving, to keep it from becoming a battlefield. Laura snorted. "What a drama. I always knew you were selfish." I stood up from the table. My hands were shaking, but my voice remained calm. "I'm tired of making excuses for wanting to live peacefully. I'm tired of being comfortable." Eric tried to say something, but I was already climbing the stairs. In the bedroom, I closed the door and, for the first time in a long time, allowed myself to cry. Not from self-pity, but from the realization of how much time I'd wasted trying to be accepted in a place where I wasn't respected. I didn't pack my things right away. I simply lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My mind was blank. Then a decision came to me, clear and unexpectedly simple. I got up, picked up my phone, and booked a room at a small hotel in the city center. For 3 days. Just to think. I packed quietly. Just the essentials. Clothes, laptop, documents. When I left the house, no one came out to see me off. Laura was laughing in the kitchen, the kids were playing, Eric was in the shower. I closed the door and realized that for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guilty. The hotel was small but clean. White walls, a large window, silence. I took a shower, ordered room service, and sat down to work. The work flowed easily, as if someone had lifted an invisible weight from my shoulders. I slept without anxiety, without the constant expectation of the door opening. I waited for a call, a message, any sign that my absence had been noticed. The first day, silence. The second, the same. Only on the third day did Eric text, "Where are you?" I didn't answer. On the fourth day, the real estate agent called. He said the neighbors were complaining about the noise, the large number of people, the parties. I told him I was no longer living at that address. He was surprised, but took note. When I returned home to collect the rest of my things, I was greeted by chaos. The living room was littered with trash. The walls were stained. The furniture had been pushed aside. Laura didn't even try to hide her irritation. "You could have warned me," she said. "We had to cope on our own." I looked at her and suddenly realized I didn't care. Her words no longer held any power over me. Eric approached later. He looked tired. "It's gone too far," he said. "But we can fix it." I shook my head.
No, Eric.
"You made a choice. Many times. Now I'm making mine." I packed my things and left. This time for good. That evening, sitting in my new rented apartment, I opened my laptop and filed for divorce. Not out of revenge. Out of necessity. I looked out the window at the city at night and felt not pain, but relief. I knew things would be tough ahead. But there's nothing worse than staying where you're not heard. I finally chose myself. Almost 6 months have passed since the day I closed the door of that house behind me. Sometimes I feel like it wasn't a door, but a solid boundary between two lives. One where I constantly made excuses, adjusted, endured, and hoped to finally be noticed. The other, where I'm learning to be honest with myself, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's scary. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. 1 floor, large windows, an old but well-maintained building. There was nothing posh about it, but the main thing was silence. Real silence. Not the kind where anxiety hides, but the kind where you can hear your own thoughts. The first morning, I woke up and for a few seconds couldn't understand why I felt so calm. Then I remembered no one was slamming doors, talking on the phone in the kitchen, demanding coffee or dinner. I started working normally again. Not to the point of exhaustion, not at night, but at my own pace. The project I almost lost was saved. The clients gave me a second chance. My boss, upon learning about the situation, unexpectedly supported me. It turned out that the world doesn't collapse if you stop being convenient. The divorce went faster than I expected. Eric tried to negotiate at first. He said he realized everything, that Laura had overdone it, that he was ready to change everything. Then he started getting angry. He accused me of selfishness, of ruining the family, of not giving him time. I listened to this without pain, because there was no responsibility behind these words, only the fear of being alone. The most telling thing was that as soon as I left for good, his family disappeared from his life as easily as they had appeared in mine. Laura found another place. The children stopped calling. The relatives for whom I had to endure suddenly turned out to be less devoted. When Eric was alone, he first encountered what he had previously shifted to me. One day, he called late at night. His voice was broken, confused. "I now understand how it was for you," he said. "They don't listen to me. No one listens." I was silent for a long time. Then I answered honestly, "I'm glad you understand. But understanding doesn't bring back the past." After that, he didn't call anymore. I began to rebuild my life. It turned out to be more difficult than settling into a new apartment. I had to learn to ask myself what I wanted, not what was expected of me. Learn to stop when I was tired. Learn not to explain my no. Sometimes loneliness overwhelmed me, especially in the evenings. But it was a different kind of loneliness, not humiliating, not empty. It was honest. It didn't require pretending. I often thought about Aunt Nora, about her strictness, about how she taught me to be strong. But now I understood what was missing from her lessons. She taught me to survive, but not to live. I was finally starting to learn to live. I developed the habit of walking in the evenings, without a goal. Just walking, looking at the lights, listening to the city. Sometimes I stopped at a small cafe on the corner, where the barista eventually remembered my order. It was strangely pleasant to be someone not out of obligation but simply by the fact of existing. A few months later, I caught myself laughing. Not smiling politely, not making conversation, but genuinely laughing. That moment became a marker for me. I was returning to myself. One day, I received a letter. A real one, on paper. From Laura. Short, dry. There were no apologies. Just a phrase about how life has put everything in its place. I didn't reply. I didn't need to close this dialogue. It was closed within me. I no longer looked for family in people who didn't see me as an individual. I realized something simple. Family isn't about the number of people at the table or grandiose pronouncements of kinship. It's about respecting boundaries. It's about listening. It's about choosing every day. One evening, I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea and suddenly thought that if I could talk to the Margaret who stood on the stairs, listening to strangers divide her home, I would tell her only one thing. You have the right to leave. And that's not a defeat.
I don't know what will happen next.
Maybe a relationship will come back into my life. Maybe not. But it doesn't scare me now. Because I know, being alone doesn't mean being lost. Sometimes it's the only way to save yourself.